A single fairy, a green tunic, a wooden flute that can bend time itself. You know this world. You can probably hum the song right now, but the man who dreamed it up is someone most players have never really seen. He has no superhero origin and no famous face. He is a soft-spoken designer from the Japanese countryside who, more than almost anyone alive, decided what video games would actually become. This is the story of how a curious boy from a town near Kyoto grew up to reshape an entire art form, and how a single cartridge, released in 1998, rewrote the rules for everyone who came after. This is the legend behind The Legend of Zelda, and the mind of Shigeru Miyamoto. Our story begins not in a laboratory or a boardroom, but in the green hills outside Kyoto. In the small town of Sonobe, a boy named Shigeru Miyamoto was growing up with no television in the house and very little money, but with something far more valuable: time, and an entire countryside to get lost in. He wandered through rice fields and bamboo forests. He waded into streams and poked around old shrines. And one day, the story goes, he found the mouth of a cave hidden in a hillside. For weeks, he was too afraid to enter. Finally, he crawled inside with a homemade paper lantern, his heart pounding, not knowing what waited around each bend in the dark. That single feeling, the electric thrill of stepping into the unknown, would sit at the very center of his work for the rest of his life. Years later, that dark cave would echo through the dungeons of his games, and even the sliding paper doors of his childhood home would reappear as the doorways inside them. As a child, he had no game console to imitate, so he drew, he painted, he built little puppet shows and flip book cartoons, and he fell in love with manga and the simple magic of making something out of nothing. He wasn't training to be a designer. He was a boy turning the entire world into a playground and quietly teaching himself the most important lesson of his future career. That wonder is something you can build. It is no accident that decades later, his games would still feel less like tests to beat and more like places to discover. He had no plan to make video games because when he was young, that job did not really exist. Miyamoto drifted into a college of arts and crafts in Kanazawa, studying industrial design and dreaming vaguely of making toys someday. He was not a star student. He took 5 years to finish a 4-year program, pouring his hours into a bluegrass band, into sketching, into almost anything but his exams. When he finally graduated, he had no job offers and no clear path forward. So his father quietly reached out to an old acquaintance, the president of a Kyoto company called Nintendo, a stern businessman named Hiroshi Yamauchi. Now, Nintendo in those days was not a technology empire. It was almost 100 years old, a firm that had built its name printing handmade Hanafuda playing cards, and had spent the 1960s stumbling through failed side businesses, from a taxi company to a brand of instant rice. Yamauchi agreed to meet the young man only as a favor. Miyamoto arrived carrying handmade toys, a clothes hanger shaped for little children, small creative trinkets. Yamauchi was not impressed by the resume, but he saw a spark, and he took a chance. In 1977, Shigeru Miyamoto became Nintendo's first staff artist. He started at the very bottom, drawing art for other people's projects, with no way of knowing that within a few short years, the entire company's fate would land squarely on his shoulders. Then came the gorilla. By the start of the 1980s, Nintendo was desperate to break into the American arcade market, and it had a catastrophe on its hands. Thousands of unsold cabinets for a game called Radar Scope sat rotting in a warehouse, money the company could not afford to lose. Yamauchi needed someone anyone to design a brand new game that could be loaded into those empty machines. The experienced engineers were all busy, so he handed the job to the young artist who had never built a game in his life. Miyamoto first tried to license the cartoon character Popeye. When that deal fell through, he simply invented his own cast: a giant, stubborn ape, a kidnapped woman, and a short hero in a red cap and blue overalls who could run, climb ladders, and, above all, jump. Even that hero's look was shaped by crude technology. He wore a cap because hair was hard to draw, a mustache because a mouth was almost impossible to render, and overalls so you could actually see his arms swing as he moved. The game was Donkey Kong, and the little hero was simply named Jumpman. When it launched in 1981, it was a sensation. It poured cash back into Nintendo of America and rescued the company. And that jumping carpenter soon earned a new name, borrowed, as the legend goes, from the landlord of Nintendo's American warehouse, Mario. It was the first time the world met the character who would become the face of the entire industry, and almost nobody realized it yet. A plumber and a princess were about to change everything yet again. This was only a few years after a historic crash had nearly wiped out home video games in America. Then, in 1985, Miyamoto and his team released Super Mario Bros. On the Famicom and the NES, and it helped bring the whole industry roaring back to life. It was fast, bright, and quietly genius. Its very first level taught you how to play without a single line of text, using nothing but clever design to guide your hands and your instincts. It went on to sell tens of millions of copies. But Miyamoto kept thinking about that cave, about the pure joy of exploring with no map and no instructions. In 1986, he and his close collaborator Takashi Tezuka released The Legend of Zelda. There was no straight line through it. The game dropped you into a strange, dangerous land and simply trusted you to explore, to uncover hidden caves, to get lost, and discover your own way forward. In North America, it arrived on a shimmering gold cartridge that looked like treasure on the store shelf. It let you save your adventure and return to it, and once you finished, it dared you to start again with a harder, rearranged second quest. Miyamoto described it as a miniature garden that a player could keep inside a drawer, a tiny secret world full of wonder. They named the princess Zelda after Zelda Fitzgerald, and the hero Link because he was meant to be the link between the player and that world. It quietly invented a brand new kind of game, the action-adventure, built entirely around curiosity, and with Koji Kondo's unforgettable music, a legend was truly born. Everything was about to change one more time, and this leap would be the most frightening of all. For years, games had lived on flat, two-dimensional screens. Then powerful new hardware arrived, and with it, the third dimension. In 1996, Miyamoto led Super Mario 64, a launch title for the Nintendo 64. It was a revelation. Using a brand new analog stick, Mario could move in any direction with real weight and momentum, while a floating camera, operated in the story by a tiny cloud-riding creature, drifted through a genuine three-dimensional space. Super Mario 64 did not just look new. It quietly wrote the rulebook for how 3D games should move, feel, and breathe, a rulebook designers still follow today. But its success raised a terrifying question inside Nintendo. If Mario could survive the jump into 3 dimensions, could Zelda? Could that fragile, precious feeling of exploring a vast and mysterious world survive the move into 3D, or would it shatter the moment you tried to build it? This was a genuine gamble. Zelda was sacred to millions of fans, and getting it wrong could wound the series for good. Miyamoto decided there was only one way to find out, and he bet the entire franchise on the answer. They built a new Hyrule from the ground up, and the project swelled into one of the most ambitious in Nintendo's history. The game was Ocarina of Time, and Miyamoto's team had to solve problems almost no one had truly cracked before. The first was combat. Fighting in a 3D space felt clumsy and confusing. Enemies were hard to face and even harder to hit. Their answer was so elegant, it bordered on genius, a system they called Z-targeting. With a single button, Link could lock onto an enemy and then circle, dodge, and strike, while always staying focused on the threat, his little fairy companion marking the target for him. Suddenly, sword fighting in 3D felt natural, even graceful, an idea inspired in part by the rhythm of old samurai duels. Then there was the world itself. The team built Hyrule Field, a wide-open expanse at the center of everything that made the kingdom feel enormous and alive, and they gave you a horse named Epona to ride across it. The world ran on its own clock, with a day and night cycle where shopkeepers slept, monsters crept out after dark, and the land simply lived whether you were watching or not. And they gave the game its very soul, the ocarina. By playing songs on that little flute, you could warp across the map, turn day into night, summon the rain, and even reach across time. Time became the beating heart of the story. A young boy drew a legendary blade from a temple of time and awoke 7 years later as a grown man, while the villain Ganondorf seized the kingdom in his sleep, leaving Link to awaken 7 sages and set the world right. The journey opened in a quiet forest village watched over by a giant guardian tree, and from there it kept widening temple after temple until the little world you started in felt like the edge of something endless. Every dungeon became its own version of that childhood cave, a dark puzzle box of locked doors, hidden keys, and a single clever item that changed how you saw the entire place. And because Link grew from a child into an adult inside the story, players felt as if they were growing up right alongside him. Miyamoto was relentless, famous inside Nintendo for tearing his own designs apart late in development, flipping the whole table just to make them better. Working alongside young designers like Eiji Aonuma and composer Koji Kondo, the team poured years of their lives into it. The reviews came in, and they were unlike anything the industry had witnessed before. When Ocarina of Time launched at the end of 1998, critics did not merely praise it, they ran out of ways to praise it. Perfect scores arrived from every corner of the world. Japan's famously harsh Famitsu magazine handed it a flawless 40 out of 40. It was named Game of the Year again and again, and for years afterward, it stood as the single highest-rated video game ever made. It sold more than 7 million copies on one console alone. Magazines had hyped it for months, and players lined up to carry it home the moment it arrived. And they did not talk about it the way they talked about other games. They talked about it the way people talk about a film that changed them. The first time they rode out onto Hyrule Field as the music swelled and the horizon opened up, the wonder of a world that felt truly limitless. It wasn't just a great game. 2.5 decades later, it still routinely lands near the top of lists of the greatest games ever made, defended by players who were children when it launched, and by critics who have played everything since. To an entire generation, it felt like the exact moment that video games finally grew up. Its fingerprints are on almost everything you play today. That lock-on combat system quietly became the invisible standard for 3D action games, from sprawling fantasy epics to blockbuster shooters. The blueprint Ocarina drew, a huge open world, a central hub connecting it all, and clever tools that reshape how you move and explore still echoes through decades of adventures. Whole studios have spent entire careers chasing the feeling that Ocarina captured in a single afternoon out on Hyrule Field. Ask almost any developer working in 3D adventure today, and somewhere in their answer, whether they realize it or not, you will find the shadow of that little fairy in that wooden flute, and the man behind it never stopped dreaming. Shigeru Miyamoto went on to help create or guide Star Fox, Pikmin, the Nintendo Wii, and so much more, becoming one of the most celebrated creators in the entire history of the medium. Yet his real secret was never the technology or the budgets or the hardware. It was always that boy outside Kyoto, lantern trembling in his hand, stepping into a dark cave for the simple thrill of finding out what might be waiting inside. He spent his whole life handing that exact feeling to the rest of us, one world at a time. That is the Legend of Zelda, and that is the mind of Miyamoto. If stories like this are your thing, stick around, because here at Game Signal, we live for the games and the people that changed everything.